Hello, linguists. Welcome to episode 49 at the Linguists Radio. Thank you so much for being with us. And please, if you are from wherever you're watching us or following us, make sure that you comment, that you share with us where are you watching us from, where are you following from. Make sure to like the Facebook page and subscribe if you are watching us from YouTube. Tonight, I have already shared it in the post, in the promotional post, but I have a guest that I actually dreamed about inviting when I started this podcast, because I have been following since I started my career as an interpreter in the legal settings, as a court interpreter, as an immigration court interpreter, and it is, as you may already know, Miss Katty Kauffman. So here she is. Welcome, Miss Kauffman.
Hello, hello, hello. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm absolutely thrilled to be joining you this evening. So, fire away. I'm honored as well. Thank you. Very
Thank
kind
you.
introduction.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna go ahead and read your bio. I'm sure many of our followers already know who you are, but in case someone is new and they don't know about you, Miss Katty Kauffman is a conference and legal interpreter, a graduate of Pedro de Valdivia School of Law in Santiago, Chile, and the certificate program in comparative U.S. Latin American legal reforms at Washington College of Law at American University in Washington, D.C. She's a member of AIC and TAALS, TAALS. She's a contributing author to the second edition of Fundamentals of Court Interpretation and a member of the editorial board of the second edition of Sandro Tomasi's Criminal Law Dictionary. She's a frequent speaker in the U.S. on the criminal procedure reforms that have swept Latin America, and a former staff interpreter with the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida, and she is currently freelancing at conferences and in court from her home base in Washington, D.C. So again, if you have any questions, any comments, any compliments, please just feel free to type them for Mrs. Kauffman. So let's start with that interview, because I'm sure we're going to have many, many questions. I do, at least. So Ms. Kauffman, tell us a little bit about, I like to ask my guests about the beginnings. And if you don't mind sharing with us, how did you ended up being a legal interpreter?
Well, first of all, thank you for that introduction. Hearing all of that, I was like, golly gee, wow, I mean, it's just me. But it sounds a lot more impressive than it really was to live it. But in any case, to get started in this field, I honestly never set out to say, I want to be an interpreter. I want to be a court interpreter. I came into this almost by accident. And in fact, it almost didn't happen. I was taking some classes with a professor, Professor Jack Child at American University, may he rest in peace. And I loved Professor Child. He was just one of those people that I said, anything this professor teaches, I want to take. And he had this minor going on in translation and interpretation. And I said, I don't know anything about it, but I'll sign up because he's teaching it. So I did. And in my first semester, I almost flunked out because I speak English at home and Spanish as well, but on different channels, really. So it's either one or the other. And I never really did this thing where you have to make them overlap. So many of our colleagues grew up interpreting for their parents or for other relatives. Well, I never had to do that. So I did one or the other, and never the twain shall meet. And so it did take quite a while for me to be able to make that overlap and to especially do simultaneous. And that's how I really fell into it. I did an internship at a legal aid organization here in the Washington area called Ayuda, which is still around. This was quite a while ago. And that is where I got my first experience in court. It was actually in Maryland. And that's how I got started.
Wow. And so can you tell us a little bit about your first experience as an interpreter? Do you remember it?
I remember some of it. I don't remember what the case was about. I just remember that it was indeed a court case. I was there pro bono, and I wasn't certified. I really probably had no business being there, but it was so long ago. There were, other than the federal court certification that I didn't even know existed at the time. To the best of my knowledge, there weren't any already trained interpreters, and I was working with Ayula. If anybody had known, it should have been them, and
Right.
they took me along anyway. So that was my first experience.
And so this was a nonprofit organization, and did you just ended up being with them because of the law? Because you were already studying law at the
No,
no.
I came to the law much later in life. So I ended up studying to become a court interpreter. I studied at the University of Arizona. I continued with my conference interpreter training. And eventually I got to the point where I said, I was doing actually some written translation at the time back home in Chile. And it was all very technical and very legal. And I said, finally, I have the time, I have the opportunity. I need to get better schooling in this. So I ended up going to law school, and it sort of overlapped with the time when I was getting my federal certification. So this was, a very long time ago. I'm going to
Yeah.
date myself, 2006.
Okay. Yeah. That's back then. You already said that they had the federal exam, but did they already have the state certifications in 2006?
I don't remember. I think there were some
Starting.
states. The
Yeah.
National Consortium, I think, existed at that point, but I don't know that it was as widespread as it is today.
There is.
I tend to do everything backwards. I became a member of IEC first, and I've sort of
Oh.
gone the opposite direction of most people. The most recent exam I sat for was for immigration court.
There's Javier Castillo saying
Eh,
hello to us.
Hello, Javier. Good to see you.
Very good to see you. And please, again, I encourage everyone to type where are you watching us from. I know Javier is in North Carolina. Yes, North Carolina. Um, so I already mentioned you guys are probably going to get sick of hearing this, but I have been following you for quite a while. I admire you a lot. And I thought if somebody is an authority in legal interpretation, that is you in my eyes. And I'm very interested in the legal setting of interpreting. I find it fascinating. I think it's like a little bit like a movie that I get to be a part of without really being a part of. So I really want to learn as much as I can, the best way I can. So the reason why I've decided to invite you was because I like to kind of have a good roadmap of where I should go when I'm taking the steps to study. So I recently took the state exam. I passed. Now I'm licensed here in Texas. And
Congratulations. That's
thank
a big
you.
step.
Yes, it was. But I think that now that I have that, I'm wondering, I'm hesitating, should I wait a little bit to go ahead and take the federal exam, which should be the next step, or should I start preparing right ahead? And the reason why I'm asking this is because I used to work at the immigration court, and I feel like that was the main reason why I passed the state exam, because I had all this experience with simultaneous interpretation and with consecutive and with some side translation even. So, I was already there in the field. Obviously we did receive a lot of training before going into the immigration courts. But so what do you think about that? What should be the roadmap that I should follow?
Right. Well, as I just said, my roadmap was the opposite. So I don't know that I'm the best role model or that I'm in any way an authoritative voice on this. I do think, however, that there are certain key factors that make, first of all, a good interpreter. others that make a good legal interpreter, and there are certain aspects that are would would mean that you're more likely to pass the federal exam. So I think this is a very individual thing. I wouldn't want to give a general rule across the board because everyone is different. We all have a certain skill set. We all have our individual backgrounds. So it's hard to make a specific recommendation or a broad recommendation for a specific set of circumstances. That said, I think you really have already summarized the answer. You had the basic skills. You had the simultaneous, you had the consecutive, you had the sight translation. Those are the skill set, that's the basic skill set that you are going to need to successfully pass the federal exam. The written exam, of course, is divided up into a number of different portions in both English and Spanish. There's reading comprehension, there's usage, there's grammar, and you really need to have, I'd say, almost a college level of both English and Spanish to be successful on that exam. It doesn't mean that you have to have gone to college. It means that you need to have that sort of level of language and understanding. And for the oral portion of the exam, you absolutely need that level of language. So if you're not up to that quite yet, then continue studying language and the way the language is used, especially the Spanish is used in Latin America. You know, those of us that are working and living in the US, we have lots of access to native speakers of English. And when we step into a courtroom or we watch Law and Order or whatever it is, we have plenty of resources. We need that sort of legal college level language from south of the border as well, not to fall into the trap of, I mean, I know there is a chapter of the RAI, the
Real Academia.
overarching in the Real Academia, the overarching Spanish language, the rulers of the language. I mean, there is a US chapter and there is now a certain acceptance of American English. But as a general rule in court, we want to use the best, quote, authoritative Spanish that we can, and that's coming out of Latin America and Spain rather than being generated here. So if we really need to look at those resources in depth to understand the language, especially the language of the law that is being used and has been used in the past in the region.
Okay, so there goes my first question that I had for you actually is do you think that a judiciary, a legal interpreter should take I guess maybe a college program or just simply go to college and study law?
You absolutely, positively do not need a law degree to be a successful court interpreter. It helps because it gives you a background, and I walk in just like you walk in and you feel like you're in a movie. I walk in and I get to see all the players and I get to see all the strategy, and I know exactly what's going on, and it's fun. But and it also means that I'm not subject to, some people say, why don't I practice law? Well, I don't like the court schedule. It's too demanding. If I want to take a few days off to go visit my dad, I just pick up and go as a freelancer. You can't do that when you're a practicing attorney. Just drop your clients. You shouldn't. I mean, you shouldn't drop your interpreting clients either. But if you have a free day, you can schedule it, right? So it's a very different scheduling thing. And I really enjoy that freedom of being a freelancer. So I don't want to practice law. But absolutely, you do not need a law degree. You do, however, need to understand what is happening in the courtroom. Now, you can get that by taking a college course. You can get it by taking interpreter training courses. The most important thing for any successful interpreter, and certainly the people I know who've passed the federal exam, you have to have a love of language and you have to have a love of research. You can't be satisfied with, oh, what does the dictionary say? Oh, what does Katty say? No, 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 no. Never take me for my word. Go do your homework, look it up, see if I got it wrong.
I like that a lot. And that's another thing that I actually just came to mind. by the way, we do have some questions. I know Mr. Cancino sent us this question on the Linguists Facebook page, which we will be addressing in just a few more minutes because we're going to be touching on those. But I had this experience in the immigration courts, and I also had to study to pass the state exam. I'm assuming that it's going to be pretty much the same scenario with federal. Obviously, it's going to be more complex, but I hope that you understand where I'm coming from here. You have the ability to perform in a federal court, and you also have to have the ability to pass the federal exam. I think they both are two different scenarios. To pass the exam and then to be able to actually work and do a good job, right? Because that's the end goal at the federal courts, which is not the same thing than state courts.
I'm certified in Florida and in Maryland, and I've worked in both of those state court settings as well. And although certainly not as much as in federal court. There are a number of reasons for that. And of course, pay is one of them. I'll be perfectly honest.
Right.
So, and I also work for Superior Court in Washington, D.C. And that's not a question of pay. I just love that. I love working for those people. It's a great place to work. Okay. So and I've forgotten the question.
I
have
said
COVID brain.
That's okay. I think that they are two different scenarios.
Two different things.
Yeah,
it's really not two different scenarios. One of the challenges, of course, with the federal exam, and I'm talking specifically about the oral, which I think is the more challenging portion of it, is that it's 220 scoring units, and you have to hit 80%. You have to get a score of basically of 80%. 80% is a pretty demanding level. That is, however, considered the baseline. The fastest portion on the federal exam is about 150 to 160 words per minute. In real life, in a federal court, it's going a lot faster than that. And so you really need to be able to perform at high speed with tremendous accuracy. I don't know that it's necessarily more complex than studying for a state exam. I think that what makes it harder isn't necessarily the terminology associated with it, but the level that you have to reach in order to pass that 80% mark. It has to do with the quality of the interpreter rather than the difficulty of the terminology. It's your skills, knowledge, and abilities.
But then it also helps, as you're saying, well, not only helps, it's probably basic or fundamental to know what you're talking about, like what you're dealing with, because you have the law that you have here in the United States, which is common law, and then the law, if you're a Spanish interpreter, for most of Latin America or Spain, which is the civil law. And so if you don't know the difference between those two, it's going to be way harder for you to
Sure,
perform.
but if you don't know the difference between those two, you're going to be hard pressed to pass the state exams.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So it's not just a question of civil versus or the common law tradition versus the continental law tradition more specifically. And also, if you look at the region today, especially in the criminal cases, not so much on the civil side or family or things like that, but again, you're not going to see that very often. It may come up as an antecedent in a federal case, but most of the time in a federal setting, you're going to be either hired by the court, majority of the time, and that's going to be a criminal proceeding, or you'll be hired by a private party, and that is usually, very often, it's overtime and other things that you say, why is this in federal court? But it'll be on the civil side.
Mm-hmm.
You may get I've done a couple of really interesting cases. There was a interstate highway traffic accidents. You're like, why am I in traffic court in a federal courtroom? but it happens. So you do get some cases, and you'll also get depositions, but that's not the same as actually being in court. Sometimes depositions, of course, can be much more demanding because you can be expected to be working for very long hours alone in a consecutive mode. But in terms of preparing, I think it's just more skills, more abilities, really having a very solid command of what you need to do as an interpreter, and nerve control. I think a lot of people end up failing the exam just because they're nervous and they can't control those test taking nerves.
Hmm. That's very, yeah, it's true. And the same thing I was told happened with the state exam. Um, so let's talk about. Um, do you want to talk about maybe some strategies that you may have for those nerves that you remember or that you may have shared with your colleagues?
Well, I think there are a couple of things that are very important. First of all, remember that it's not the end of the world. Even though the federal exam is only offered every 2 years, it is offered again. So if you don't pass this time, you do have another shot. So again, it's not the end of the world, it's just a test. The other thing is, remember, of course, to get plenty of rest. You don't want to go into an exam tired. If your brain is going to work a lot better, a lot faster. As interpreters, our brain is our primary tool. So be sure that you give it all of the things that the brain needs: water, rest. I actually recommend that you don't study the day before the test. Just stop, do something else. Make sure you go for a walk, go for a hike, get some fresh air, clear your mind, do a number of breathing exercises. If you do yoga or if you're into mindfulness, those kinds of things can really help control nerves when you go in and sit down. But perhaps the thing that I tell my students the most is remember to breathe. Because we get so right uptight and we end up going like this and our shoulders come up like this. And what's happening is that your diaphragm is closing and you can't actually breathe and the sound is not coming out and oxygen isn't getting to our brains. And that is all going to defeat the purpose of a good performance. So sit up straight, breathe, and remember to breathe. Breathe deeply, breathe in, breathe out, and begin.
Those are great advices. Very simple, all of them to follow. And we do often forget to breathe.
To
I
breathe.
know that, yeah.
Don't forget to breathe.
So let's address Mr. Junkinsina's question here. What kind of exercises can we practice to improve our consecutive and simultaneous interpreting skills?
So there are really two things that will help that have a certain overlap between consecutive and simultaneous. Of course, consecutive, we're going to eventually need very good note-taking techniques. And when we talk about note-taking techniques, obviously the idea is not to write down everything. The idea is just to write down the things that we need to help us remember. So how do we remember? What kind of exercises can we use for memory? Because we'll need that memory in consecutive and we need it in simultaneous. Things are coming at us very quickly, but we still have to find workarounds and adapt syntax and so forth. So we need to be able to maintain certain memory of what's been said. One thing that I think is very helpful is visualization. If I say it was a sunny Friday afternoon and I was walking down the street when suddenly two people came at me. One was wearing a polka dotted shirt, the other was wearing a striped shirt. If I just say that, you probably have started envisioning the sunny day, I was on a street, two people. Now, you might want to, if you're doing, especially in consecutive, you might want to make a note that one was polka dotted and one was striped, because we might tend to forget those little details. But you can easily envision this. And one of the nice things about court and about court interpreting in general, and especially when people are doing testimony and you're working on the stand, very often we can use the visualization technique very effectively to support our memory because they're telling a story. And if we focus on the story, on the content, rather than the individual words, we're going to be able to retain more. So practicing that visualization, using different techniques to support that our memory will be very helpful for consecutive, and it will also help us for simultaneous. As we're envisioning that, envisioning in simultaneous really becomes something known as anticipation, where you sort of know what's coming before the person says it. Obviously, you don't say it until they do, but you can see where things are going, especially with things like opening arguments, closing arguments, even sometimes technical witness expert testimony. You kind of know where things are going if you have a good background. If you've studied and you know your gun terminology, for example, you shouldn't be thrown by a weapons expert on the stand. You already know what they're going to say.
Very interesting. Oh my gosh, there's Miss Veronica de Michelis. I love hearing from her. So we have one more question from Mr. Cancino, which is, what kind of exercises can we practice for long consecutive interpreting without notes?
Okay, so I would say that question is an oxymoron, because there's no such thing as long consecutive without notes. And the question is also, how do you define long consecutive? I mean, what is long? In court, long for the federal exam is 50 words. In a conference setting, 10, 15, 20 minutes, longer. If you go back and you look at the consecutive that our colleagues were doing before the advent of simultaneous, before we had the equipment that we have today, they were doing an hour or more at some of the major diplomatic conferences. An hour of consecutive. That is long consecutive.
Yes.
I don't really think that there is much room in the courthouse for long consecutive, and by long in this context, I mean 5 to 10 minutes. The judge wants to know what's going on in his or her courtroom. And you also don't want to get yourself into a situation where you've taken notes for 5 minutes and you start your rendition and someone says, "Objection." Because by the time they resolve that, you may not really know what your note said. Your notes are for immediate production, not 5, not 10, not 15 minutes later. They're for immediate production. So you don't want to get yourself into that situation. So for quote unquote long in court, a minute, 2, maybe 3, a witness who's very emotional on the stand and you don't want to interrupt them, then you do need to be taking notes. There is no such thing as a long consecutive without notes. You need to practice your note taking.
So what do you do? And this is something that used to happen to myself and many of my colleagues at the immigration court, when you have a witness that is constantly going back and forth on their story. So it's very hard to envision this, this is a story that you're telling that you're telling us about. I think we're very good at it when it was a coherent, flowing story, but then, well, I'm sure you know what I mean. Like, it's probably something that they're making up, or they are not very sure of what to say, and they go back and forth and back and forth. And what do you do? That's more of a personal question that I have, I guess.
Yeah, I think there are ways on the notepad to organize things and to use arrows to continue, to put it up, down, and around and so forth. I always say that, I am very respectful of the environment, but when we're taking notes, this is not the time to save the trees. You want a good sized notepad. You want something. I don't actually have a good notepad in front of me right now because I'll show you in a second what I'm actually using to save the trees. But if you have, there you go, but you have a notepad, right? Exactly. You want something, however, that preferably has a spiral across the top so that you can flip your notes over this way. And what I'm actually using to save the trees is called a rocket book. And you can actually, I just take a wet, basically it's a wet rag, and you can just,
delete it. Yeah.
delete it, which helps save the trees, and it works very well. But that way you can take, I have plenty of room. It's a bigger page. I would not use this physically in the courthouse. It's too big to hold comfortably. But since we're working remotely, it's pretty comfortable and I can use it very effectively. I do want to share with you a little trick of the trade. And if you've seen the Wired video I did, you'll see that I did that in this as well. So if you know that there are going to be terms that are going to be coming up a lot, like a defendant's name or an acronym or certain words that you know that you're always going to forget just because you always forget them, right? Supply and demand. I always want to say suministro. Well, no, okay. So it's oferta y demanda. So right when I know if I'm going into an economics conference, I write that down because I know that my brain is just, I don't know. It goes to suministro instead of oferta. So what I do is, as they say, nobody's perfect, right? Or nobody's perfect. Certainly not me. So you take the last piece of paper, the last page, and you fold it over like this, right? And then you can hold it. Therefore, you can take your notes here. And on this side, you can put your notations. And that allows you to flip your pages and still keep that cheat sheet visible throughout the entire exercise.
Perfect.
So that is very helpful, especially if you've been able to prepare for a hearing and you have a bunch of notes things that are likely to come up, you can use that technique as well. Going back to the original question, how to handle that, it really does depend. I use a lot of arrows and use a lot of paper.
Okay. But have you ever had to tell or ask the judge to please redirect the witness? Like, Your Honor, the interpreter is not able to.
Rather than do that, I would probably interrupt sooner. As soon as I feel like I can't, that's it. I can't take any more notes. I can't follow it. I'm going to lose it.
Okay. Yeah. Good.
Your Honor,
That's what that's what a lot of us ended up doing.
If necessary, yes, talk to the hand. Stop. And if I have to, I may gently say, "Me da un momento," right?
Yeah.
And interrupt.
Okay, awesome. Go ahead.
I was going to say, I once had a case in Chile with a witness who was bipolar, and she was off her meds.
Jeez, that must have been hard.
That was very hard.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was very hard.
Well, Ms. Kauffman, let's talk about.
Please, it's Katty. Nobody calls me
Katty.
Ms. Kauffman.
Okay,
it's like when my students call me professor. I'm like, who's that?
Perfect. Okay, Katty. Let's talk about the criminal terminology for Latin America, for the United States. What are the basics that we need to know to do a good job?
Well, now that we've seen Javier Castillo pop up on screen, I actually did areas again. I did a course for Javier a while back that's called Deep South Terminology.
And I'm going to share
self-promotion there. There we go. Yep. And it's available as an on-demand course with Javier. And basically, I delve into the current criminal terminology in Latin America and Spain. And you can see on screen, if you just scroll down a little bit, there's another upcoming course, but that's it. Deep South Terminology. No, we're not talking about, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. We're talking farther south than that. Chile, Argentina, Colombia, Mexico. Mm-hmm. So focusing on the terminology in use in that part of the world today. with the reforms that started in the early 2000s, there has been this wonderful movement that has been so helpful for us as interpreters because the language has become so much more standardized. It used to be that every court system had completely different terminology, completely different institutions. And today in Latin America, general rule. Of course, there are still exceptions, but we see an increasing trend toward greater standardization. So you'll see institutions like el juez de control instead of juez de instrucción, right? So the juez de control, okay, it has a few different names. In some places, it's a juez de garantía. In others, it's a juez de garantías. In other places, it's a juez de control de garantías. But they all do pretty much exactly the same thing. And for us at the federal level, it's really akin to what a magistrate judge does when they're hearing criminal cases. So we're getting some nice, neat legal equivalents as a result of these changes that we really didn't have before.
That's awesome. I took the course that you taught with Renato Mendez with Verba Volant, and we're going to be talking about some other courses that you're going to be doing with them as well. But myself and other colleagues, we had the chance to comment on them, and it was just absolutely fascinating. We learned a lot in those 2 weekends. I think it was a couple of weekends that we did it. Very.
That was 8 hours. It was in depth. It was
yes.
it was intense.
It was intensive,
fun.
but it was great
Intense and
because
intensive, yeah.
we learned so much, and that's when I realized that there is so much to learn about the different processes, criminal processes. In this case, you basically focused on the criminal courts and the federal courts. So I loved every single aspect, but it was a lot. And I was able to follow up until one point. And then it was like, okay, this is something that
Over
I need
my
to
head.
sit down and study more in depth. But so where can we find courses similar to that one that you taught with Renato? Because I don't think it's available on demand anymore.
No,
but
unfortunately, I do need to talk to Renato to see if we can get that as an on-demand course because I think there might be some interest in it. The one that I did with Javier is not as intensive. It's shorter, but it's substantively the same material.
Okay.
Again, not as in-depth, more broad brushstroke overview, but it's good for an introduction to the subject matter if you're really just getting started and understanding the comparative aspects of criminal procedure between the US, again, focusing on the federal level, and what's happening in the criminal procedure reforms in Latin America.
Perfect. Okay. So let's talk about the federal exam now. Let me check my notes real quick. And I did want to ask a question about comparative law. And would you like to share something about that? What would be useful for us, or any programs that you may know that we could take advantage of?
I would say, I don't know of any specific comparative law classes. I mean, my love of criminal procedure leads me into a really unique niche in that regard, and I do love it. I do really enjoy learning about what's happening in different places and sharing that. And I'm a nerd. It's great fun. I think you really do have to be a nerd to be a good interpreter because it's the study side. It's it's been a long time since I've been a formal student, but I consider myself a student anyway because I have to study every single day.
Right.
Every single day. And I'm always learning. And I think that for a nerd like me who loves learning, this is the best profession in the world because you get paid to learn. I mean, how cool is that? Who else gets paid to learn other than academics? Right?
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
100%.
So I really don't have any courses that I can point to in comparative law. I can say this: do your research. There are so many tools that we have available now. YouTube, you can go and watch court proceedings in Mexico and Chile and Colombia. You can sit, instead of watching court TV, you can watch real cases happening in Spanish today.
Yeah.
And I suggest that everybody do that, and don't stick to just to one country. Watch different countries, get a feel for it, understand what the proceedings are like, and move on and find another one. And just keep doing that to really understand how these things work in practice.
So my last question that I had prepared for you was if you think there's any difference between the technique that judiciary interpreters have to have versus other interpreters, medical interpreters. What techniques do we need to perfect to be able to perform at the level that is required, let's say in state courts? I don't know so much for federal courts, but since you have also worked in state courts, what do you think is the technique that we must absolutely perfect?
The simultaneous mode is essential. And, I don't think there's really a difference in what we should demand of ourselves as interpreters. Our first requirement is that of accuracy, to add or omit nothing as court interpreters. And that really sets us apart from the conference world or even from the medical world. Very often in medical interpreting, you're working consecutive, and there is a role for an advocate under certain circumstances for the interpreter to be a patient advocate. There isn't in the court system. Our code of ethics really does not allow that. And that's something that's unique to court. You can't summarize as you can do in conference. You can't make it sound nicer and sort of just, get flowery as you can do in conference. You have to be spot on. And that's the same whether you're in federal court, state court, immigration court. You're not supposed to add or omit anything. And we all know that sometimes we do omit things because they were going too fast, we didn't hear it, or we didn't understand it. But that's reality, right? But the theory is that we shouldn't. And that's the standard across the board. So whether you're working as simultaneous in state court or federal court, you should be performing to the same level. And especially if you're working in criminal proceedings, I think defendants deserve it.
Yes, definitely. We have one more question from Mr. Gancino, which is, how can we improve our memory and retention with some practical exercises for long consecutive interpreting? This is a little more towards conference interpreting, but go ahead. What would be your answer?
Well, you could still do 3 to 5 minutes in court. It's likely that the judge will interrupt and say, let the interpreter speak, basically, because again, the judge wants to know what's going on in his or her courtroom. But yeah, 3 minutes is certainly relatively long for a court setting. Your note-taking techniques have to be refined to do this. You need to have a system of symbols. You have to have a specific layout on the page. There's really no right way or wrong way. There are tried and true techniques for this that you can study. But at the end of the day, it's going to be your notes. So you're the only one that has to be able to read it. If you are very artistic and you can draw a house with things coming out of it, that's fine. I can't. I can barely draw a stick figure. I have no artistic skills whatsoever. So I'm going to rely a lot more on letters, combinations of letters, rather than elaborate drawings of things. I mean, even if I wanted to draw like a male or a female symbol, I get those confused. So I just write M or W, right? So everyone needs to develop their own, and that really only comes with practice. The types of exercises that you can do: retention. You can practice watching videos and then try to use, again, all of your techniques, your visualization, your chunking techniques. Everyone, I hope, knows what chunking is, sort of separating things out into segments so that you can try to identify the key parts and the things that you're likely to miss. Develop your note-taking technique, subject, verb, object, as I say, subject, verb, object, blah, blah, blah. And that blah, blah, blah can be put in different places. Again, there are techniques that you can study for this, but the only way to do it really is to develop that note-taking technique that will come with those memory and retention exercises.
And I can attest to that. I have taken several courses on consecutive. I took advantage of 2020 and followed different strategies from different instructors. And what stuck with me the most was Andy Gillies' technique. I mean, he taught several ones, but the one that stuck with me the most was the one where you have your utterance that you have to interpret, and you just write down words that will trigger your memory. And that has actually worked wonders for me. But I used to be stuck, for instance, in the subject, verb, object, and that would give me a lot of trouble when I was practicing. So finally, when I was able to identify with this other technique and saw the results in my performance, I realized what everyone was talking about, which is very personal. It's something very personal. It's an individual thing. So go ahead, try different techniques, and whatever sticks, work on that, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I do follow subject, verb, object, but I use words or partial words most of the time. But again, it's highly personal. If that is what works for you, and you're successful and you're accurate, that's what we need. Accuracy, right?
Yep. Yeah, definitely. Okay, so Katty, tell us about what courses do you have, either on demand or coming up? We have talked about the one for Javier Castillo, which is, we're showing it here right now on the screen. And I also shared my screen. This is in case you want to see how it looks like. This is how it looks like here. Let's share. This is CastilloLanguageServices.com. And it's a course that Katty has on demand there. What else? This is
that one is
coming up.
It's upcoming. It's how to prepare a challenging criminal court terminology. I'll be talking about research techniques. I'll be looking at, websites and places you can go in Latin America to find terminology and how you begin to reconcile and investigate terms when you come across them, both in English and in Spanish. So that's coming up in August. The Deep South that I've already spoken about is on demand. In addition to that, of course, I do have a website. I don't have everything posted on it, but I have a few videos and different things that are available on my own website. Which is that, exactly, KattyKauffman.com. And it is Katty, not Kathy. Just let me put that on the record. People, not you, but other folks out there that do, Kathy, call me Kathy. And my attitude is, you know what? I have way too much personality. No disrespect to the Kathys of the world, but I personally am not, nor have I ever been a Kathy. So Katie, Katty, hey you, all of those things work.
Okay. So here's your website.
Here's
Katty
the
Kauffman
website.
and Associate Language Services.
Exactly. And I do have a thing there for training. I don't have a whole lot of that fleshed out, but if you click on it, you can see that there are some court interpreting training programs. The Federal Court Interpreter Training Program. I do this with De La Mora training and interpreter training. And there are two. There's an on-demand course that is available on the De La Mora website. And I'm also doing a live federal oral exam prep course with them starting June 14th.
Which is this one. Hold on, let me share the screen real quick.
And I know people's schedules are complicated and you can't always make the live classes, but I do think that there is a lot to be gained by taking the live course if you possibly can. I mean, I don't want to diss my own on-demand class. I think it came out quite well, but getting instructor feedback is an important part of the process, and colleague feedback
Yes.
in any interpreter's training. And I think that if you have the opportunity to take live courses, they are certainly preferable. And I tell you, I did a lot of continuing education in 2020 as well. I was sort of laughing as you said that, because I took everything as well. I took everybody's classes. It was great.
It was a great opportunity. So why would you miss that, right?
It really was. And shout out, by the way, to the Maryland Court Interpreters Program. They were wonderful throughout this pandemic in providing training opportunities for interpreters for free. And I really need to congratulate Maryland on doing that. It was very great support.
That's awesome. And Veronica de Michelis is saying that you will teach a webinar on Cite for Simul for ATA. They're very
Yes.
excited about it. So tell us a little bit about that, please. What is it going to be about?
So Cite for Simul is really something that I coined, and it has to do primarily with court. It's what happens when you walk in, when we're able to walk into a courtroom, and suddenly the prosecutor, the state's attorney or the government attorney, the AUSA, comes up to you with a proffer and says, "Here's the proffer," and then they're going to read it at a gazillion miles an hour, and you have to render it in simul, and you may or may not have, you may have maybe a minute to scan it, but you better be able to read that text and interpret, listen, read, and interpret at the same time. And that's what I call Cite for Simul, because you're really doing a cite translation while you're listening and self-correcting as you go.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Perfect. So that, I think, it's something that we absolutely must take, because you're probably going to be sharing a lot of comparative law, because you need to have the basis on that, right? To
No,
know the
there's not.
terminology. Not really.
I won't be talking so much about the procedural side of the terminology side. It's really the technique of, how do I do this? How do I listen, read, and speak at the same time?
Perfect. Okay. Yeah. I'm still interested. And then one more that you have is something with Renato Mendez again from
Yes.
Verba Poland, which is coming up very soon. Let me also share this.
Yep, this is on the 22nd. It is a free webinar on simultaneous interpreting platforms. So I'll be talking, yes, about Zoom, but more about the other platforms. Everything from VoiceBoxer to Quaqua to Kudo and Interactio, a bunch of them.
Okay. And this is on May 22nd, so it's coming up in just
It
9
absolutely
days.
is. It absolutely is. That one, of course, will be in Spanish, as is everything that I do with Verba Volant. And that's exclusively on RSI, not so much focusing on the court side, more on the conference side.
By the way, I do have to give a shout out to Renato. I have taken several of his courses, and he gathers all these amazing professionals and interpreters and some translators as well that are just, again, authoritative figures in the field, and just provides the best programs. I am so impressed with all the work that he's been doing. So shout out to Renato. Please keep doing the amazing job that you're doing.
Absolutely. I signed up for the class that Andy Gillies, the second round of his consecutive, and I wasn't able to attend in person. I'm still watching the videos. But it's great. It's fabulous. Andy is, the most authoritative figure in consecutive, I'd say, in the world. He literally wrote the book. And having the opportunity to take training with him is just spectacular.
I know. I mean, that's another dream, of course. You are kind of a goal. Andy Gillis Pro is going to be another goal, and Mr. Barry Olsen is also another goal that I have to invite here to the program and share all of his knowledge. But with that, Katty, it has been an absolute pleasure to have you here. Thank you, by the way, linguists, for joining us and sharing every comment. Thank you to Veronica. She is with ATA. And thank you for letting us know about Katty's coming up webinar on Site for Simul. Definitely the ones that can, please join Katty. And I don't know if you want to say anything else before we say goodbye to our followers.
No, just thank you very much for this invitation. I hope people have found it either helpful or entertaining, and I hope you have gotten out of it what you wanted. I know that you had very high expectations for this, and I was feeling the pressure. So hopefully I have met those expectations. And again, it's been a pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to talk about interpreting in general, court interpreting specifically, and just thank you for the opportunity. It's been great. Thank you.
Yeah, I love that you are so passionate about it. I feel like when I never knew this, but when I when I started going to the courts, I thought, wow, this is very thrilling. It's another energy that I didn't get in the medical setting. I didn't get in the community setting. So I think this is my jam. And I love how passionate you are about it. So I had to invite you. So thank you so much for accepting the invitation. Thank you to everyone for watching us. And we will see you linguists next week, because we have one of our dearest members of Facebook. That's all I'm going to say for now. It's going to be with us next week. So I hope you join us and have a great weekend. And we'll see you soon. Bye, linguists.
Bye-bye. Thanks. Have a good night.